Hey, welcome to 49cc Scoop. My name's Brent. I've now put over 2,000 miles on the RC1, and I haven't taken the cylinder off since just prior to 500 miles, so it's a bit overdue for a checkup. I want to start by telling you about a couple of longer rides that I took in the summer. I've rode my scooter with the RC1 in it at the beach for car and bike shows quite a few times now, but I've always put it in the back of the truck to take it there. I'm roughly 70 miles from the beach, so when I used to ride the scooter there and back, it would be around 175 to 250 miles or sometimes a little bit more, and I've had days ranging from about 8 to 16 hours of pretty much straight riding. About 5 years ago, I hit a deer coming home from a car show, and I've only ridden back and forth to a car show one time since then, because honestly, it's just not that much fun riding long distances through cornfields and trees at night after having that experience. I've always wanted to avoid having my scooters be what I'd call trailer queens, the kind of bikes that get trucked or trailered everywhere and not ridden. But after trying taking the scoot down in the truck, I found that I actually enjoyed my days more without worrying as much about breaking down or wanting to get back before dark. With the RC1 being a racing engine, I assumed that it would be much more prone to issues anyway, and for years I've heard from different people that higher revving setups aren't good for real riding. But so far, the 94cc has actually been more dependable for me than my previous top performance 86cc or more generic 100cc liquid-cooled builds built on Minarelli clone cases. That made me think, why not just ride it down to the beach one day? So I did. I stayed around 55 miles per hour most of the time heading there to try to save gas, and that got me about 43 miles per gallon. After making a lap around town, I headed back, going faster and with a little bit of a headwind at times, so I only averaged about 30 to 35 miles per gallon. The Scoot ran great all day for 175 miles, and I even gained a subscriber when I passed him on the highway. The first ride went so well that I decided to try it again on the 4th of July. It was in the mid-90s and very humid, and it was obvious that the tune was too rich for the weather right from the start, but I carried on anyway. I tried adjusting the idle mixture and speed screws multiple times, but nothing changed much, and I was constantly trying to keep it from cutting out at lights. Naturally, when it finally shut off, it did it at one of the busiest intersections in town. I checked it over and couldn't find anything obviously wrong, so I installed a new spark plug and it fired right up. It still felt sluggish and it still struggled to idle, but I was all the way down there, so I wanted to make a full lap and I carried on around town. Eventually, I finished the lap and headed home. I looked the scooter over after the ride and found that the silencer bracket was broken, the headlight wasn't secured and it rotated, and a mount for my homemade storage box broke off of the frame. So the first ride was almost perfect. I had a blast and enjoyed every bit of it. The second ride was kind of miserable and multiple things broke or came undone. If I had spent some time tuning before the second ride, I think that I probably would have enjoyed that one too. but the parts failures are still there as a reminder that high RPM setups can be tough on the whole scooter, especially anything not well isolated from vibration, and jumping the front wheel up and down probably doesn't help a whole lot either. At that point, I realized that I had 2,154 miles on the RC1, and it hadn't been apart for a check for over 1,600 miles. I needed to take the gas tank off anyway to repair the broken tab on the frame, and I was going to build a flange for the Stage 6 exhaust while I was at it, which was shown in a prior video, by the way, if you want to check that out. So it seemed like a good time to see how the cylinder and piston were holding up. The head and cylinder mating surfaces looked like the O-rings were sealing well. This lighting accentuates the scuffing for some reason, but there was nothing that could be felt with a fingernail, and in different light it was easy to see the original cross-hatching in the cylinder. What looks like some sort of damage on the exhaust port bridge was there from day one, when the bridge was relieved during manufacturing. The piston also had some minor scuffing and discoloration, but looked good overall, and the ring still moved freely in the groove. I cleaned everything up so I could take precision measurements and find out exactly how bad the wear really was. The cylinder was doing very well. From new to now, the most wear that I've found in any bore diameter measurements is 3/10,000ths of an inch, or about 8 microns. The piston has worn quite a bit more, about 18/10,000ths of an inch, or 46 microns. The combination of those things gave me piston to cylinder clearances of basically 5/1000ths of an inch, or about 0.13 millimeters. Malossi's clearance spec for the RC1 is 0.048 to 0.056 millimeters, or right around 2/1000ths of an inch. So I'm roughly 2.5 times over spec. It seems pretty clear that the piston needs to be replaced, but looking at past data made me question that decision. When this kit came out of the box, I measured clearances hovering around 3/1000ths of an inch, or 71 to 79 microns, so it never met their spec. And when I mentioned this in a video, others told me that they had the same experience with the wider than specified clearances. Still, 5/1000ths of an inch is considerably more clearance than I would ever like to see, and I had a C piston kit around, which is supposed to be about 0.02 millimeters larger than the original A piston. By my measurements, it's actually around 0.015 millimeters larger, but I don't claim to be totally accurate to that level. The C piston would put clearances much closer to spec, though still not within spec. I started to have my doubts when I looked at the wear pattern recorded to date. A lot more wear occurred to both the cylinder and the piston in the first 469 miles than in the last 1,685 miles, so it appears that there was an initial wear-in process where everything got sort of comfortable with each other, so to speak, and then wear dropped off quite a bit. I wondered if I would be better off with the old worn piston and a new ring versus the new larger piston, because the new larger piston could potentially cause another more drastic wear-in process like when it was all new, and that may reduce the overall life of my cylinder kit more quickly. Ultimately, I decided to go by the book and installed the new C piston to tighten everything up, with fingers crossed that I won't need to pull it apart for many more miles. I did mock-ups to get squished to 0.58 millimeters before port matching the base gasket and doing a final assembly and leak testing. I should probably note that I did do a couple of quick checks to make sure that the crank and bearings were okay before assembly and didn't find any issues there. I also cleaned the entire CVT while I was at it. Most of it was pretty recently serviced, but it was on the bench, so why not? The drive belt was still at 19.2 to 19.3 millimeters after 783 miles, with a new spec of 19.5 millimeters, so the Polini belt is holding up very well for me. The bearing inside of the CVT cover was noisy and it felt a little bit gritty, so I did replace that. My puller refused to grab it, so I tried the more time-consuming but kind of fun method of stuffing bread in there with a punch until it forced the bearing out. If you've never heard of this before, it's all over YouTube, and you can also use thick grease to do the same thing, but I kind of like the bread because it's less messy and it soaks up some of the grease that gets forced out of the old bearing. I used the rubber-sealed 638 RS bearing to replace the metal shielded bearing because I've had much better luck with those in Minarelli clones that have a similar drive shaft support in the CVT cover. I ground off the old broken storage box mount and welded a new one on before the engine went back in. Just a quick touch up here with no proper painting methods. This entire frame could use a full going over and a new paint job or coating, and the scooter's ugly anyway, so I'm just not concerned with the finish. I also swapped in a hefty 1,200-pound rear shock. I noticed that the rear of my scooter really jumps up a lot under throttle, and most drag racers have very little movement back there. This thing is pretty wheelie prone, so I wondered if I could calm it down a little bit by just reducing some of that movement. But I didn't want to use a solid bar, so I just went way overboard with a heavy-duty shock. I made a new clamp for the MHR silencer with a piece of 1.5 inch wide by 60,000ths of an inch thick 304 stainless steel because I didn't see Malossi selling a replacement. The headlight issue was just that one of the 3 clips that hold it had came out, so it was fine after reclocking it and installing a new clip. Once all of the loose ends were tied up, I heat cycled it and checked over fasteners before doing some more gentle riding to break in the new piston kit, and then Dragy testing to see if acceleration was where it should be. RPM was low and 8th mile times were 0.3 lower than my best on average, so I fiddled with weights and shimming the drive boss and improved it a little bit. I took a 1/10 off, but even with an 1/8 gram weight change, I couldn't get it to settle right into the sweet spot of RPM. I think a belt change may be beneficial because it slips off the line instead of grabbing and trying to throw me off right now, and the belt is more glazed than I've been seeing, even though the width is fine. Ocean City Bike Fest was coming up though, and I wasn't that concerned with every last 1/10 just to go cruise around and play with some Harleys, so I left it like that. I switched back to my old rear shock along the way as well, because the big shock didn't reduce wheelies or do anything positive that I could tell, and it was so stiff that it never even moved with my weight on it and beat the heck out of my back. The only other change that I made was installing a BR9 EG spark plug right before Bike Week. I've been using 10 series NGK plugs, but cruising around the beach is usually a lot of slow rolling and sitting at lights, so I figured maybe the 9 series would help to reduce fouling. Spoiler alert, the 9 series worked out well for me at the show and came out with much less raw fuel on it than the 10 series typically has. I'll go back to a 10 series for regular riding to be safe, but I think a 9 series plug will be my go-to for putting around at the beach. Speaking of putting around at the beach, my next video will be from Ocean City Bike Fest. You don't want to miss that one. I got to ride with a couple of other RC1 powered scooters, sport bikes, Groms, Harleys. It was a whole lot of fun, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already. If you've enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and thank you for watching.